It was raining in San Diego that day, rare, heavy rain that seemed to fall just for her. The kind that blanketed everything in shades of gray, as if the sky itself was mourning. Clara sat by the window, her hands motionless in her lap, a shawl loosely draped over her shoulders, her expression unreadable. From behind, she looked like a porcelain doll, still, fragile, and hauntingly beautiful. But her eyes, fixed on the streaks running down the glass, held stories no one bothered to ask about. Nathan stood in the hallway with his arms crossed tightly across his chest. His mother, Margaret, hovered beside him like a shadow. Her perfume, floral and choking, lingered in the air. Neither of them spoke to Clara. They didn't need to. The silence between them had long since stopped being awkward. It had become strategy. "Is the van coming soon?" Nathan asked, avoiding looking into the living room. 15 minutes, Margaret replied, adjusting her silk scarf. Her fingers twitched at the thought of everything falling into place. "She'll be fine," she added, not because she believed it, but because she needed Nathan to. But fine was the last thing Clara was. 2 months earlier, a stroke had stolen from her everything that made her feel human. Her speech had vanished. The right side of her body refused to obey. Her days blurred together in a haze of hospital rooms, unanswered prayers, and the constant, quiet ache of watching the people she trusted most look at her like a burden. Clara wasn't stupid. She'd heard Nathan whisper to Margaret when he thought she was asleep. Heard the sharp edge in his voice as he said, "I can't do this forever, Mom. She's not getting better." Margaret had never liked Clara. Too ambitious. Too opinionated. A woman like Clara didn't belong in Margaret's picture-perfect vision of her son's life, a vision where Nathan, the loyal and sweet boy she had raised alone, married a docile, obedient wife who knew how to cook, clean, and keep quiet. Clara, with her marketing job and dreams of launching her own agency, had been a crack in that fantasy. And now she was broken. Silent. Weak. It was, in Margaret's mind, almost poetic justice. That morning, Margaret had dressed Clara herself. She spoke loudly and cheerfully while tying her hair back, her tone coated with a sugary cruelty. "We're taking you somewhere special today," she said. "Fresh air, peace, real people. Not this exhausting city. Doesn't that sound nice?" Clara had wanted to scream. But the words stayed trapped behind her lips. The somewhere special was a small, nearly forgotten village tucked away in the damp forests of Sitka, Alaska, a place Clara hadn't seen since childhood summers with her late grandmother. It was remote, quiet, and far enough away that no one would ask questions. Nathan had claimed it was a rehabilitation retreat. A chance for her to be closer to nature. A place to recover slowly and peacefully. But Clara knew better. This wasn't about healing. This was about disappearing. They had hired a woman to look after her. Denise. A part-time janitor at the local high school with a known drinking problem and a reputation for looking the other way. She'd agreed to be Clara's caretaker for a meager stipend, funded, of course, by Clara's own savings. Margaret insisted it was all they could afford. The plan was simple: drop her off, cut contact, let nature take its course. Clara's health was deteriorating, after all. According to one optimistic doctor, she had less than a year. Why waste resources? Margaret spun it like mercy. She'll be surrounded by the memories of her childhood. That's where she belongs now, she told Nathan. And when the time comes, well, at least she'll have died with dignity. Clara sat in her wheelchair as the front door opened and a cold gust of wind swept through the house. Nathan wheeled her out wordlessly. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the day she came home from the hospital and heard Nathan call her a shell. She had hardened in the silence. The ride to the airport was agonizing. Nathan refused to make eye contact. Margaret busied herself with a crossword puzzle. They spoke over her, not to her. Only once, when Clara's head drooped from exhaustion, did Nathan glance at her. There was something unreadable in his eyes then. Not pity. Not love. Something more clinical. Like a man watching a machine that no longer functioned. The plane was small, the turbulence brutal. The layover was long. Then came the final stretch, a dirt road winding through endless trees, narrowing until even the forest seemed to close in around them. Clara didn't recognize anything. The last time she had been here, she was 7. They arrived at dusk. The house was still there. Her grandmother's old wooden cottage, now blanketed in moss and rot. The roof sagged. The garden was a wilderness of thorns and weeds. It looked like no one had touched it in years. Denise stumbled out from behind the shed, wearing mismatched shoes and a threadbare coat. Her breath reeked of vodka. "She'll be all right," she slurred, waving half-heartedly at Nathan. Clara wanted to run. But her legs didn't work. All she could do was stare as Nathan unloaded her bags, handed Denise an envelope thick with bills, and turned to face her one last time. "You'll be okay," he said, though his voice cracked. "It's just, this is best for everyone." She didn't blink. Didn't nod. Didn't flinch. And then he left. Clara sat outside as the sound of the car faded into nothing. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and resignation. Denise dragged her inside like old luggage and left her in the front room, facing a broken window and the dying light. That night, as Denise passed out on the couch with the TV blaring static, Clara stared at the ceiling. Her fingers twitched. Her mind raced. She remembered the inheritance letter, the one she had told no one about. A German grandmother on her father's side. And estate. A fortune. All in her name. Nathan didn't know yet. But he would find out. She was sure of it. He would come back for the money. And when he did, he wouldn't find the woman he left behind. That night, Clara made a promise, not with words, but with the fire that surged through her paralyzed limbs. They had abandoned her here to die. But Clara Reynolds had other plans. For the first few weeks, Clara didn't move much. The sharp pang of betrayal still echoed in her chest like a second heartbeat. The silence in the old cottage was loud with ghosts, memories of her grandmother humming by the stove, the crunch of pine needles under her childhood feet, the pages of storybooks turning in the stillness. Now, those memories felt like props in a forgotten theater. The walls were the same, but everything else had changed, especially Clara. The nights were the hardest. Cold, isolated, and endless. Denise was hardly a presence. Most evenings she was either out, slurring nonsense with the neighbors, or asleep on the stained couch, her snores vibrating through the floorboards. Clara often sat in her wheelchair by the frosted window, her fingers curled awkwardly on the armrest, eyes trained on the black trees that stood guard outside. The quiet should have been peaceful. Instead, it became a pressure, building and pressing into her skull. But beneath her stillness, something inside Clara had shifted. A seed had cracked open. It didn't sprout overnight. It didn't come with fury or loud declarations. It came quietly, like a match lit in a cellar. A whisper that said, "Not yet." One day, Denise left early in the morning and didn't return until after midnight. Her drunken footsteps thudded against the porch, her laugh echoing through the forest. Clara, left alone for nearly 20 hours, had dragged herself from the chair to the floor, inch by inch, her left leg dragging like dead weight. She had bruises up her arms, a gash on her knee. But she reached the small chest in the hallway where Denise had stuffed away her personal items, a purse, a folder of legal documents, a phone that had long since lost charge. Clara pried it open with a spoon. The phone was her first victory. After finding an old charging cable, she let the battery sit overnight. When the screen finally flickered to life, Clara cried for the first time since being left there. Not from grief, but from the smallest taste of control returning. She began moving. Slowly at first. Crawling. Then pulling herself upright against the bedpost, holding the walls as she shuffled. Her right hand still trembled, barely responsive. Her speech was no better than air against her throat. But she wrote. She trained herself to scribble with her left hand, filling a worn notebook with words, fragments, names. Nathan. Maya. Inheritance. Lawyer. She remembered the letter, the thick cream envelope with her grandmother's name, sent from Stuttgart. She had opened it just before the stroke. It had contained the will, the papers naming Clara as the primary heir to a small estate, a vineyard, and a rather sizable trust. She had told no one, not even Nathan, intending to surprise him once everything was finalized. But now, the idea that he might discover it, and claim it, was unbearable. Clara's thoughts began to crystallize. She needed help. And there was only one person she could trust. Jordan. They had met in college. Jordan was bold, fiercely intelligent, and devastatingly direct, a civil litigation attorney who handled cases like a conductor leading an orchestra. Clara remembered how she had tried to convince her not to marry Nathan. "There's something about him," Jordan had said. "He doesn't look at you like a partner. He looks at you like a life raft." But Clara, enamored and naive, had insisted. Now, miles and mistakes later, she knew her friend had been right. With shaking hands, Clara typed out a message. "Jordan. It's me. I need you." Then she waited. It took 24 hours. The call came through with Jordan's name glowing on the screen. Clara didn't answer, she couldn't speak, but she sent a video. Her pale face, bruises on her knees, her lips trying to form words that didn't come. She mouthed, "Don't call back. Just come. Alone." 3 days later, Jordan stood in the doorway of the cottage, rain dripping off her trench coat. She didn't speak at first, just stared at Clara, who now stood, hunched and trembling, supported by a broom handle. "My God," Jordan whispered. Clara leaned forward and whispered, so faint it was almost breath, "They left me to die." Jordan stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her friend, holding her as Clara shook in silence. That night, by the fire, Jordan listened to everything. The stroke. The village. The abandonment. And finally, the inheritance. Jordan didn't speak for a while, but when she did, her voice was steel. "We're going to make them pay," she said. "But we'll do it smart. Quiet. Precise." They made a pact. No direct contact with Nathan. No obvious legal threats. Not yet. They would give him time to believe she was gone. Let him feel safe. Comfortable. Then he would come crawling, and that's when Clara would rise. Jordan hired a private investigator, a veteran named Sam, who had worked on domestic fraud cases for nearly 2 decades. Sam followed Nathan for weeks, documenting meetings with Maya, overheard conversations about investments and incoming money. He even recorded one chilling statement. "Once Clara's situation resolves, I'll be able to fund the whole launch. I just need patience." The cruelty was casual. Dismissive. Like she was already a corpse. Clara listened to the recording with hands balled into fists. But she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply wrote another note. Let him come. In the meantime, Clara transformed the house. With Jordan's help, they cleared out the rot, fixed the fireplace, cleaned the pantry. Jordan returned to San Diego with a plan. She'd visit monthly under the guise of checking on a remote property. Denise, offered double what Nathan paid, agreed to maintain the illusion that Clara was still incapacitated. She would report back regularly, say Clara hadn't improved. Denise didn't ask questions. She didn't want to know more. Clara also connected with an online support group for stroke survivors, joining through voiceless chat and a pseudonym. She listened. She learned. She began working with a physical therapist via pre-recorded sessions and made slow, painful progress. Each day, she recorded herself attempting to walk, speak, and write. And then came the website. SilentBloom.com, an online store Clara built herself over weeks. Selling herbal teas, handcrafted soaps, and remedies based on her grandmother's recipes. She didn't use her name. No one needed to know who she was, not yet. The store was simple, elegant, and quickly caught traction among wellness communities. Sales trickled in. She earned enough to pay Denise, order supplies, and even set aside funds for something bigger. One early morning, as the mist rolled in from the coast and the trees looked like silhouettes in a painting, Clara walked 10 steps across her living room unassisted. She collapsed at the end, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. And then she laughed. A quiet, broken sound, but it was hers. The woman who had been wheeled into this house to be forgotten was gone. In her place stood someone new. Not whole, not healed, not yet. But awake. And watching. Clara had never heard silence like this before. In San Diego, even the quiet had rhythm, distant car horns, the hum of city life bleeding through the windows. But here, in the forgotten corners of Sitka's wilderness, silence felt like a sound of its own. It pressed against her skin like fog, filled the rooms like smoke, and forced her to listen to everything she had once ignored. Her healing had not come in lightning flashes. It was a slow, aching unraveling of who she had been and a quiet reconstruction of who she might become. Her mornings began with the same ritual, a stretch, a whispered mantra, "I am still here," and a walk across the living room floor, sometimes unaided, sometimes not. She had stopped counting how many steps she could take before her legs gave way. That no longer felt like the point. What mattered was that she could rise. Jordan continued to check in, delivering supplies and encouraging words. Together, they had replaced the cracked kitchen tiles, repainted the hallway in a soft ocean blue, and replaced the sagging curtains with floral prints that reminded Clara of her grandmother's aprons. The house, once a prison, had transformed into a quiet sanctuary, not just for her body, but for her mind. She worked in the mornings, sitting at the dining table with her laptop, managing the online store she had built. Silent Bloom was no longer a secret project. Orders had started coming in from across the country. Blogs had picked it up. Someone on Instagram had featured her lavender balm in a small business Sunday reel. She packaged everything by hand, adding handwritten notes in delicate cursive with her left hand. No one knew who she was, but they could feel something in her words, a kind of grace that only came from survival. By the 3rd month, Clara had planted a garden. It was wild, uneven, stubborn, like her. She dug with trembling hands, tore weeds from the soil with her knees in the dirt, and whispered apologies to the worms she unearthed. She planted thyme, rosemary, basil, and rows of lavender that caught the wind like tiny violet sails. The act of nurturing life grounded her, gave her something to believe in beyond vengeance or pain. One afternoon, as she struggled with a tangled hose by the porch, a truck pulled into the long-forgotten driveway. She straightened up, her breath caught somewhere between surprise and caution. From the driver's side stepped a tall man, broad-shouldered, with windswept hair and boots that had clearly walked farther than most men's pride would allow. He raised a hand in a non-threatening gesture. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "I'm Elias. I live down the road. Thought I'd come by and introduce myself properly. Saw your garden and figured you weren't just passing through." Clara hesitated before nodding once. "Clara," she said softly, her voice a rasp that still hadn't regained full strength. Elias didn't react with pity. He nodded, understanding. "You've done good work out here," he added, looking at the garden. "Trying," Clara replied. It was a strange moment, not flirtatious, not forced, just two people standing in the shadow of quiet lives, recognizing something in each other. Before he left, Elias offered her a basket of eggs and said he could bring firewood next week, if she needed. She thanked him. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. But he came back. Once a week at first. Then twice. Sometimes with firewood, sometimes with nothing at all, except a quiet willingness to sit with her on the porch and sip tea without conversation. Clara didn't ask questions. Elias never pushed for answers. It was, in its own way, perfect. One day, as she stood over her growing rows of herbs, Elias offered to help her build a greenhouse. His own hands bore scars and calluses, and he moved with the ease of someone who had long made peace with labor. Clara agreed. They worked together under the watchful eyes of crows and fading autumn light, hammering, lifting, adjusting, wordlessly efficient. In those hours, something settled between them, not romance, not yet, but a kind of trust neither of them had known in a long time. One evening, as rain tapped against the window and the fire crackled in the hearth, Clara opened her laptop and saw the sales dashboard. She had reached her first milestone, 1,000 orders. She blinked at the screen, then leaned back, her eyes misting. It wasn't the number that moved her. It was what it meant. She mattered again. Not to Nathan. Not to Margaret. Not even to Elias. But to herself. That night, she lit a candle and wrote herself a letter. You are not what they said you were. You are not what they tried to make you. You are the bloom in the silence. And you are not finished yet. She folded it and placed it in a wooden box that once held her grandmother's recipes. When Jordan returned the following weekend, Clara greeted her at the gate, walking without her cane. Jordan gasped, nearly dropping the bag of supplies she held. You look like a woman who just woke up from a long, bad dream, Jordan whispered. I think I did, Clara said. And for the first time in almost a year, she smiled. They cooked that night, real food. Roasted vegetables, cornbread, fresh tea from the garden. Clara moved with newfound ease, laughing when she burned her hand slightly on the oven rack, shaking her head at the irony. Do you remember when I told you not to marry him? Jordan asked, wiping her mouth with a napkin. Clara nodded. And I remember not listening. You ready for him to come back? Jordan's voice turned serious. Clara stared into the flickering candlelight, her smile fading into something steadier. I'm not just ready. I'm prepared. Jordan leaned back in her chair. What if he doesn't come? Oh, he will, Clara said calmly. Men like Nathan never walk away from money they think they deserve. And when he does, he's going to walk into something he won't expect. The next morning, Clara went into town, for the first time. Her hair was pinned back, her lips tinted with a soft rose hue, her coat cinched at the waist. She no longer looked like a ghost. She looked like a woman with intention. At the post office, she mailed out 20 packages of Silent Bloom's newest collection, winter herbal care kits with spiced balm, healing salves, and cedar incense. She noticed a few glances, small-town curiosity, subtle nods of recognition. Let them wonder, she thought. Let the story build itself. At the corner store, she bumped into Mrs. Halpern, a retired schoolteacher who had known Clara's grandmother. My goodness, Mrs. Halpern said. You look just like Rita did when she first moved here. Clara smiled gently. That's the nicest thing anyone's said to me in years. You staying long? Long enough to finish something important. Mrs. Halpern nodded. Good. This place needs people like you again. That evening, Elias returned with a tray of fresh apple cider and cinnamon biscuits. They sat on the porch, watching the stars needle through the dark sky. Clara told him about the vineyard in Germany, about her business, even about the man who left her here. Elias didn't interrupt. He just listened. When she finished, he asked, Do you hate him? Clara thought for a long moment. No, she said finally. But I don't forgive him either. Not yet. That's fair. They sat in silence, the way only two people who understood pain without explanation could. Later, as he left, Elias turned and said, If you ever want help expanding the business, or setting up a market stand in town, just ask. I know people. You've built something real, Clara. She watched his truck disappear into the mist, then turned back toward her home, her sanctuary, her fortress, her beginning. The wind rustled through the lavender as if whispering, It's almost time. And Clara knew. The woman they had tried to bury had not only survived, she had bloomed. And the roots she had planted here, in this cold, quiet land, would not be pulled up again. It was late September when the letter arrived. The trees in Sitka had begun their quiet metamorphosis, shedding green for golden fire, as if the world itself was preparing to let go. Clara stood on the porch, cradling a mug of tea, when Elias handed her the envelope. "No return address," he said softly. Clara didn't need one. The handwriting alone summoned a coldness in her chest she hadn't felt in months. It was from Nathan. She didn't open it right away. She let it sit on her kitchen table, unopened, while the wind howled through the trees and the fire whispered inside the stove. She moved through her day as if it weren't there, organizing silent bloom orders, folding laundry, writing in her notebook. But the envelope waited. Like a snake in a basket. When she finally opened it, the words were what she expected: veiled concern, hollow sentiment, and underneath it all, a quiet, hungry curiosity. Nathan had heard through someone that she was doing better. He was glad to know she was recovering and wondered if they might have a conversation soon, maybe even revisit the topic of their marriage. He hoped she was being wise with her inheritance. It wasn't a letter. It was bait. Clara folded the paper in half and placed it gently into the fireplace. It caught fire slowly, curling like a spider's legs. She watched it until it turned to ash. 2 weeks later, he came. He pulled up in a rented SUV, shiny and polished, its tires spitting gravel as it turned into the narrow driveway. Clara was in the greenhouse, trimming basil, when she heard the engine. She didn't rush to the window. She didn't run to hide. She stayed where she was, calm, composed, trimming her plants with precise fingers. When Nathan stepped out of the car, his eyes scanned the house like a thief calculating entry points. He looked healthier than she remembered, but thinner, more strained. The lines around his mouth had deepened. His posture, once slouched with dependence, now bore the false straightness of a man pretending to be in control. He knocked once. Clara answered. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her presence spoke louder than anything she could have said. Her hair was pulled back in a neat braid, her face clear and confident. She wore a simple linen dress and bare feet, and when Nathan saw her standing without assistance, his mouth parted in disbelief. "Clara," he said. She nodded once. "But, how? When did you?" She tilted her head slightly. Her silence wasn't weakness this time. It was power. "Can I come in?" he asked, already stepping forward. She didn't move aside. She simply stared. Nathan hesitated, then pulled at the edge of his collar. "Look, I know this is probably a shock. I didn't think, well, the last time I saw you, you weren't walking. You weren't speaking." Clara let the silence stretch. "I know things between us weren't perfect," he said, shifting. "And maybe I didn't handle your illness the best way. But you're here now. You're healthy. And I think we have a lot to talk about." At last, Clara opened the door wider and gestured for him to come in. The house was spotless, cozy, alive with scent, herbs, warm bread, cedar wood. Nathan stepped inside and looked around like a man entering a museum of someone else's better life. "You've really made something here," he muttered. Clara motioned toward the kitchen. She poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one. He took it awkwardly. "I still roaming. I don't even know where to start," he said, sinking into a chair. "Maybe with the money? I mean, your grandmother's estate, you didn't tell me about it. I had to hear from a mutual friend." Clara sat across from him, expression calm. "I just think we should be fair," he continued. "We were married, Clara. Legally, we're still married. Anything you've built here, this house, that business, I mean, some of it's probably joint property." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm not trying to fight," he added quickly. "I'm just trying to get what I deserve." At that moment, the front door opened, and Jordan stepped inside, dressed in black slacks and a tailored blazer, holding a folder thick with papers. "Perfect timing," she said, without greeting him. Nathan stood. "Jordan? You remember me," she said, her voice cold. "Clara's lawyer." Among other things. You brought a lawyer? He asked, blinking. No, Clara said softly. I never needed to. She's always been here. Jordan handed Clara the folder. Clara opened it, flipped to the right page, and slid a document across the table. What is this? Nathan asked. Your betrayal, Jordan answered. In writing. Inside was a printed transcript of a conversation, Nathan's voice, clear and damning, talking to Maya about Clara's inheritance, his business plans, and his intention to leave Clara as soon as the money was his. Nathan paled. I didn't. That was adultery. Abandonment. Financial coercion, Jordan said, ticking each point off. We've got recordings, photographs, witness statements. Would you like to hear Maya's testimony? She gave us a lovely account of how you met, what you promised her, what you said about your invalid wife rotting in the woods. Clara said nothing. She watched Nathan squirm. You left her to die, Jordan continued, her tone hardening. And now you're here, with that smug little letter about joint assets? Let me be crystal clear, this house, the business, the land, even the seed money, it all came from a separate inheritance. In Clara's name. You are entitled to none of it. Nathan's jaw worked. You're bluffing. Jordan smiled. We've already filed. The divorce paperwork is ready. You'll be served formally next week, but we thought it polite to give you a preview. Oh, and by the way, the community property you think you're owed? The judge is likely to side with the injured party. Especially when they see these photos. She pulled out a photo of Clara from her first month in Sitka, bruised, thin, strapped to a wheelchair, abandoned. Nathan flinched. You don't get to come here and demand anything, Jordan said. You don't get to knock on this door and pretend you're a victim. For a long time, Nathan said nothing. Then he looked at Clara. I did love you, he said quietly. Clara blinked, then spoke for the first time. You loved control. He swallowed, stunned by the strength in her voice. I needed you to believe I was gone, she continued. Because if I hadn't disappeared, I would never have seen you clearly. But now I do. And I am not the woman you left. He nodded, numbly. I guess I should go. Jordan didn't move to see him out. Clara didn't either. He left without another word. As his car vanished down the road, Jordan turned to Clara and said, You didn't even raise your voice. That's more devastating than anything I could have done. Clara stared at the doorway, then closed her eyes and took a long, slow breath. Later that week, they stood in a courtroom back in San Diego. Clara walked into the room unassisted. Her hair was pulled back. She wore a navy suit, clean and elegant. The judge glanced at her, surprised, then back at the file in front of him. Nathan, seated at the opposing table with his lawyer, couldn't seem to look at her. Margaret was behind him, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, feigning grief. Testimonies were heard. Evidence was presented. Maya testified via video call, her voice bitter, her eyes cold. The judge listened, mostly in silence, before finally setting down the documents. The court finds in favor of the defendant, he announced. Mr. Collingsworth is not entitled to any portion of the property acquired after the inheritance, nor to any part of the business revenue. Given the circumstances of abandonment and proven infidelity, the defendant is awarded full ownership of all assets. A final bang of the gavel echoed like a shot. Nathan didn't fight. He simply slumped. Outside the courthouse, the air was heavy with city noise. Clara stood on the steps, watching traffic roll by like memories. Jordan stood beside her, arms crossed. It's done, she said. Clara nodded. No. It's just beginning. They got into the car and drove toward the airport. Clara looked out the window, eyes full of clarity, watching the skyline fade. Back home, Elias was waiting. Not with champagne or flowers, but with a quiet hug that said everything. That night, Clara unpacked the last box she had kept sealed since the stroke, the one labeled before. Inside were photos, letters, pieces of her life before everything had fallen apart. She kept a few. She burned the rest. And when the fire dimmed, she wrote again. You are not your silence. You are the voice you gave yourself. You are the storm that followed. And you did not come to beg. You came to reclaim. And you did. The snow came early that year. In Sitka, the cold arrived without warning, blanketing the trees and rooftops in a hush of white. Clara stood at the edge of her garden, now tucked in under frost, her hands nestled in wool gloves as she watched the wind twist flakes through the evergreens. She was no longer the same woman who had arrived here on the edge of death and silence. She had shed the weight of betrayal, survived the courtroom's fluorescent brutality, and come out the other side with something more valuable than victory: clarity. A month had passed since the judge delivered his ruling. Nathan had disappeared quietly, retreating from the wreckage of his claims with no real resistance. Margaret, once so loud and venomous, had gone silent after the verdict. Rumors in San Diego said she'd moved into assisted living, still insisting she was the victim. Clara hadn't wasted a moment thinking about either of them. That part of her life had closed like the final page of a book she never wanted to read again. In their place was something new, delicate, real, and blooming. Elias had been there through every moment, not as a savior, but as something steadier, a presence she could lean on without shame. Their relationship had grown slowly, watered by shared mornings and the quiet rituals of building a life. There was no need for grand declarations. He never asked her to explain her past or prove her worth. He just saw her, as she was, and chose her again and again. The greenhouse they built together now housed rows of winter vegetables and herbs under thick panes of glass. Silent Bloom had become more than a small shop, it was a movement. Orders poured in from across the country. Clara had begun mentoring women online, offering free resources on starting small businesses, especially for those who had experienced trauma or domestic emotional abuse. The platform had grown beyond her expectations, turning into something that looked and felt like legacy. But perhaps the most unexpected change of all had come quietly, without fanfare. Clara had missed her cycle twice. At first, she thought it was stress, exhaustion, maybe even early menopause. But when the small plastic stick confirmed it with quiet certainty, she sat in stunned silence on the edge of her bed for almost an hour. A baby. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't dared to dream of it. When she finally told Elias, he didn't react with panic or doubt. He simply pulled her close and whispered, "Then we begin again." Now, standing at the garden's edge, Clara pressed a gloved hand to her stomach. She was only 8 weeks along, but her body already felt different, tender in places, alive in ways she couldn't describe. It terrified her, this tiny thing growing inside her, this second chance wrapped in cells and hope. But it also lit something within her that felt like light breaking through storm clouds. Jordan visited later that week, stomping snow off her boots at the front door, holding a folder in one hand and a bottle of sparkling cider in the other. "You're glowing," she said the second she saw Clara. "Don't start with me," Clara laughed, ushering her inside. They drank cider beside the fireplace, watching flames crackle and break apart. Jordan updated her on the mentorship program's legal framework, how many new applicants had come in, how their nonprofit filing was almost complete. "You realize what you've done, don't you?" Jordan asked, setting her glass down. "You didn't just survive. You turned survival into service. You're going to change lives, Clara." Clara shook her head gently. "I don't want to be anyone's symbol. I just want to live a life that's mine." "And you are," Jordan said. "In every way." The next morning, Clara woke to the smell of cinnamon and wood smoke. Elias was already up, cooking something in the kitchen, humming low under his breath. She lay still for a while, one hand cradling her belly, listening to the sounds of this new life. She had never imagined she would get to feel this way again, safe, grounded, and surrounded by love that asked for nothing more than her presence. Later that day, they drove into town to visit a property Clara had recently purchased, a small, run-down community center that hadn't been used in years. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, her boots echoing on the wood floors, the air thick with dust and potential. "We'll turn this into something beautiful," she said, her voice soft but firm. Elias nodded. "A place for healing?" She turned to him, smiling. "For healing, for gathering, for starting over. I want women to come here and feel what I felt when I stepped into my grandmother's house again, that they are still whole, even if the world tried to break them." They spent hours walking through the space, measuring, sketching, dreaming. By nightfall, Clara's fingers were numb, but her heart was warm. Weeks passed. Winter deepened. The day Clara and Elias married, the sky was overcast but calm. The ceremony was held by the sea, with only a handful of guests, Jordan, some local friends, a few of Clara's new men who had flown in just to be present. Clara wore a simple cream dress, her hair woven with sprigs of lavender from her garden. Elias wore a navy suit and held her hand like it was something sacred. There were no vows read from paper. Just eyes locked across a short distance, and a whispered promise. "I choose this life, with you, again and again." After the ceremony, they walked along the shore in silence, shoes in hand, the cold biting at their ankles. Elias glanced over and asked quietly, "Do you feel like you've come full circle?" "No," Clara said, turning to him. "I feel like I finally stepped off the wheel." She no longer chased validation or feared loss. She no longer held on to the past like armor. She was not the woman in the wheelchair. She was not the broken wife, the forgotten girl. She was something else entirely now, reborn, rewired, whole in ways pain had never touched. As the new year crept closer, Clara launched the Silent Bloom Foundation, a non-profit offering resources for women recovering from emotional abandonment, illness, or betrayal. With Jordan as legal counsel and Elias helping manage the property logistics, they turned the renovated community center into a haven for storytelling, shared meals, and growth. On opening day, Clara stood at the front of the room, holding her speech with trembling fingers. She looked out over the crowd, survivors, mentors, donors, strangers who had followed her blog and now saw her in person for the first time. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I was left behind," she began, "and I learned that sometimes, what we call an ending is simply the start of a new chapter no one else has written yet. This place, this life, none of it was in the plan. But it is everything I never knew I needed. And I hope it becomes that for you too." The room erupted in applause. Clara's voice broke a little when she thanked them. Not out of fear, but out of awe for what had bloomed from the ashes. Months later, after the snow thawed and the earth returned to color, Clara gave birth to a daughter. They named her Mira, after the Latin word for wonder. Holding her for the first time, Clara cried, not because of the pain, but because in that moment, everything made sense. All the silence. All the survival. All the slow blooming that had led her here. She whispered into her daughter's ear, "You come from strength. From soil that refused to stay dry. You come from women who were not rescued, but who rose anyway." Years from now, when Mira would ask about her mother's past, Clara would tell her the truth, not the pain in graphic detail, but the path through it. She would speak of healing, of choosing light, of growing even in the darkest corners. And when Mira would ask what Silent Bloom meant, Clara would smile and say, "It means we are allowed to begin again. Always. Even when no one believes in us. Especially then." Clara had lost everything once. And then, she built something better. Not louder. Not bigger. But true. And that, more than revenge, more than justice, was the most powerful ending of all. It was not the silence that defined her anymore. It was the bloom that came after. Clara's story is not one of simple survival, it's a testament to the profound power of self-worth, resilience, and the courage to rebuild when everything familiar has crumbled. She began her journey as a vibrant, ambitious woman whose life was abruptly shattered by a sudden stroke and the betrayal of the very people who were supposed to love and protect her. Left in a remote, forgotten village to wither away, her husband Nathan and his manipulative mother, Margaret, saw her condition as an inconvenience, something to be quietly pushed out of sight while they schemed to take what was hers. But what they failed to realize was that Clara was still there, watching, listening, thinking. And most of all, she was still alive. Her silence became her strength. As they turned their backs on her, she turned inward, planting the seed of a plan that would become a quiet, powerful revolution. With the help of her loyal friend Jordan, Clara faked her continued disability, quietly gathered evidence of Nathan's infidelity and intentions, and slowly began reclaiming not only her physical health but also her identity. She transformed her grandmother's neglected home into a sanctuary, learned to walk again, and launched her business, Silent Bloom, which began as a humble herbal shop and blossomed into a thriving brand that touched thousands. But more than the business, Clara nurtured something even more vital, her sense of purpose. She was no longer surviving for the sake of proving someone wrong. She was building something for herself, on her terms. And then came Elias. Unlike Nathan, Elias did not see Clara as someone to save or fix. He saw her as whole, even in her pain. Their relationship, rooted in mutual respect and quiet companionship, grew not from dramatic declarations but from shared labor, trust, and quiet mornings on the porch. It was healing, not just romantically, but spiritually. Through Elias, Clara rediscovered what it meant to be chosen not for what she could provide, but simply for who she was. When Nathan eventually returned, drawn by the scent of money and the illusion of entitlement, Clara stood tall, not just physically, but emotionally. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She presented truth like a mirror and let him see the reflection of who he'd become. And in a courtroom filled with facts, evidence, and the undeniable force of her testimony, Clara emerged not just as a victor, but as a woman reborn. The story could have ended there, a clean cut, a courtroom win. But Clara's true transformation unfolded afterward. She turned her personal triumph into public service. She opened a community center, launched a foundation, and mentored women who, like her, had been cast aside, silenced, or stripped of their power. She planted seeds in others, helping them bloom in the silence of their own trials. And when she gave birth to her daughter, Mira, Clara knew she had closed the loop not with revenge, but with love. She was no longer defined by what had happened to her, but by what she had done in response. So, what's the lesson here? Clara's journey reminds us that betrayal does not define us. Abandonment is not the end of the story. When others try to write you off or leave you behind, you still have the pen in your own hand. You still have the power to rewrite the narrative. Her story teaches us that silence is not weakness. Sometimes, silence is strategy. And beneath that silence, a new strength can take root, a strength that grows quietly, patiently, and fiercely. In our own lives, we may face versions of Clara's betrayal. Maybe not as dramatic, but real in their hurt. A toxic relationship. A lost job. A health scare. Moments when we are cast aside or underestimated. In those moments, we must remember that healing takes time, but it also takes choice. We must choose to rise, even in pieces. We must choose to believe that we are more than what was done to us. And we must allow ourselves the grace to begin again. Like Clara, we can turn pain into purpose, scars into strategy, and survival into something beautifully sacred. If her story moved you, if you found a part of yourself in her resilience, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel, support the stories that matter, and help us continue creating content that doesn't just entertain, but empowers. Your support means everything. And who knows? Maybe the next story will be yours.